Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, journalist Vince Beiser looks at how the race to mine metals and other natural resources needed in technology is impacting geopolitics and the environment. Wall Street Journal global metals and mining reporter Julie Steinberg interviews him.
His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming now on Peacock.
He will kill again, unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him, and I will kill him myself.
I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Vince, tell me what spurred you to write this book. You mentioned that you bought an electric car in 2018. Is that where it started?
Yeah, pretty much. Like a lot of folks, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I was really concerned about climate change. There was, wildfires happening all over the place, and summers were getting hotter and hotter. And I felt like, I got to do my part. I'm going to get myself an electric car. And I felt very, very self-righteous and very virtuous about it. Here I am doing my bit to save the planet. But, fortunately or not, I'm a journalist, and I write often about kind of the story behind all the things that make our lives possible. Where do all the raw materials come from that go into, the stuff that make our lives possible? So I started to wonder about, how my car had been made. I knew that, it had this great big battery and it had this motor, and where did all the stuff for that come from? So I started looking into it, and to my horror, I found that the many metals involved in making my electric car were the hunt for those metals all over the world is causing massive environmental damage, mayhem, and murder all over the world. And I figured this is a really important story that needs to be told.
Let's talk more about that main paradox that you just said out here, that as the world races to decarbonize and electrify, we're creating a whole new set of problems, some of them quite deadly.
Yeah, this is the thing. So, the world is switching faster than a lot of people realize. We are switching over to renewable energy and to electric cars, right? Solar power, wind power, and electric vehicles, which we absolutely must do to head off the biggest threat that we face right now, which is climate change. But the terrible paradox is that, in our rush to save the planet, we're actually doing a lot of damage to that planet, because while these, renewable energy is great for the climate, doesn't emit much in the way of carbon emissions, but it's very hard on the Earth itself. And that's because all the actual machinery that we are counting on to get us into this new all-electric age has to be built. It has to be manufactured, and it's mostly made out of metals, out of lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths. We're going to need billions of tons of all these things in the next few years. And if we end up digging them up out of the earth, just ripping them out of the ground the way that we have historically, we're going to end up trading one set of problems for another. So none of that is to say that, renewable energy is bad or that electric cars are bad. They're not. They're better than the alternative, but they do come with their own really serious costs. And we have to, first of all, I think it's really important that we understand those costs, and then do what we can to minimize them, because there is a lot that we can do to keep those costs down.
Before we get to the opportunities and maybe like the hopeful part of this interview, we have to wade through a lot of the depressing parts first. In every chapter of the book, you outline something that on its face sounds really good for humanity, whether that's mining minerals important to the energy transition, like lithium or recycling. But there always seems to be a cost. I was always waiting for the next paragraph where you say, but here's the cost. How aware were you of these costs going into the research, and how much did the research show you?
As I said, I wasn't really that tuned into it. I mean, I sort of, I've been, like I say, I've been sort of reporting on this kind of thing for a long time, and I've come to realize that there are no perfect solutions, right? We all want a silver bullet, like, this thing is bad, so let me do this thing that's all the way good. But those kind of things just don't exist in the real world. There's always some kind of trade-offs. I really did not. I was really surprised by the kind of scope and the scale of the harm that's being done, the damage that's being done in our pursuit of so-called clean energy. And I don't even use the term clean energy because, as I say, there is so much damage being done. And really to realize how implicated all of us are in every way, because it's not only renewable energy, it's not only electric cars, solar panels, and wind turbines. It's also digital technology. All of our computers, our cell phones, our Game Boy, our Xbox controllers, the digital tech also relies on pretty much the same basket of 8-10 metals that we need for renewable technology as well. So in a way, we're sort of moving into this new era where some of the most important, the most defining aspects of this era that we're moving into are, of course, digital technology and the internet, which is already here and only getting more important, and electricity, when we're trying to switch from fossil fuels to power everything by electricity. I call it the electro-digital age. And, as I say, in many ways, it's an improvement. But if we're not careful, as we move into this new age, we really run the risk of repeating some of the worst mistakes of the last era in terms of the harm that we're going to do to the planet, the number of people that are going to suffer as a result of it.
Let's talk about some of those harms. Take copper, for example. Copper this year has been on a tear. Prices went crazy high in the first half of the year. Companies have been, scouring the globe for it. That we've seen a lot of huge M&A deals in pursuit of it. You mentioned some pretty horrific examples of violence over copper. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the, way sort of under the radar effects of the rising price of copper is it drives up copper theft, right? I mean, copper theft has been a problem for a long time. All over the world, people steal copper cables, copper manholes, like whatever's got copper in it because it's worth some money. But as the price goes up and up and up, the incentive to steal it gets bigger and bigger. So there's really a worldwide wave of copper theft. And this runs the gamut from literally people robbing trains in Chile, guys driving up, pulling up alongside trains carrying copper in Chile, which of course is the world's biggest copper producer, jumping on board the trains, cutting out copper cathodes, these big slabs of copper, tossing them onto the back of pickup trucks and just riding off into the night. That kind of thing is going on. But I think the most disturbing is in South Africa, where copper theft has really hit an industrial scale, where you have armed gangs that are stealing thousands of miles of copper cable, tearing apart, electrical infrastructure to get the copper. And it's causing a level of disruption and damage to South Africa that really you only see during wartime. I mean, the city of Johannesburg gets blacked out regularly. Hospitals are shut down, train lines are shut down, all because people are stealing copper on such a scale. And there's a lot of violence that comes with it as well. There are many people have been killed over copper theft. That's everything from, security guards and police that are trying to stop the copper thieves, who are literally just gunned down by these armed gangs. Sometimes it's gangs fighting with each other over access to copper. And sometimes it's in a lot of the sort of poor townships where people are so fed up with power being cut off because of copper thieves. There's been lynchings where the local folks, see strangers coming into their community and they think they're copper thieves, and they've literally stoned them to death, burned them to death, lynched them because they're so furious at the disruption caused by all this copper theft.
Pretty grim. And then things don't seem any better when you talk about cobalt in your book. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you saw there?
Sure. I mean, so cobalt is probably, of all these harms we're talking about, cobalt's probably the one that most people are familiar with. And it's the children working in cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So about 70% of all the world's cobalt comes from this one country, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the poorest, most corrupt, most, immiserated countries in the world. But they happen to have these enormous deposits of cobalt, and cobalt is a crucial ingredient for batteries, for the lithium-ion batteries that power most of the world's electric vehicles, that power all of our cordless devices, almost all of our cordless devices, everything from your cell phone to your cordless drill to, you name it. They've all got these batteries that rely on cobalt as one of their key ingredients. And as I say, almost all that cobalt comes from the DRC. And the working conditions in many of the mines there are just absolutely horrific. I mean, it's just as bad as you can imagine. People with no safety equipment, or even shoes, sometimes going down into these hand-dug pits deep below the ground that collapse all the time. And one of the most shocking things is there are thousands and thousands of children working in these cobalt operations. Some as young as 7 or 8 years old. Yeah, and it's been going on for quite a few years. It's garnered a lot of attention, and there's been a lot of talk about cleaning up the cobalt supply, getting the child labor out of it, improving working conditions. But it does not seem to have made a whole lot of difference on the ground. It continues to be, one of the darkest spots, one of the most, the most appalling examples of the human and environmental harms that are being caused by our need for these metals.
And as you say, some people or many people might be familiar with the issues there, but what about lithium? Because to your point earlier, when we first started the conversation, I think a lot of people, when they first get their EVs, they're so excited, they think they're doing right by the planet, and might be surprised to learn that lithium can be pretty environmentally destructive.
Yeah, absolutely. So the world's biggest known deposits of lithium are in Chile, again, in the north of Chile, in a place called the Atacama Desert. And it's been a big supplier to the world for a very, very long time. I think it's now the world's second biggest supplier after Australia of lithium, but still a major, something on the order of 25-30% of all the world's lithium comes from Chile's Atacama Desert. And the problem there is it uses a lot of water. The process of extracting lithium from the desert there uses up a whole lot of water. Basically, the lithium is found in these underwater sort of lakes of brine, this very, very salty, very mineral dense water that's underneath the surface, that's been there for millions of years. And the way that they extract it is they drill down and they pull the water, those brines, to the surface, and then just spread it out under the desert sun in these enormous ponds. I mean, like miles and miles and miles of ponds. And what happens is the sun just evaporates out the water, and you're left with this sort of thick lithium-rich slurry that you can then process further into lithium. So in some ways, it looks good because you don't have the usual stuff that goes with mining. You're not digging enormous pits. There isn't enormous machinery that goes with it. But the problem is you're using lots and lots of water. All of that water that evaporates out is lost to the environment. And even though it is a desert, there is a lot of life in that desert. There are these strange and very unique lagoons that form in the desert that are home to rare types of flamingos There are all kinds of wild birds, wild guanacos, which are sort of these llama-like creatures. They all live in that desert on what little water there is. And there are also indigenous communities just a few miles from these lithium operations that have been there for at least 12,000 years, as far as anybody can tell. And they are very, very concerned that these lithium operations are sucking up what little water there is in the desert and imperiling basically everything that lives there, all the the animal life, the microbial life, and also these indigenous communities that have been there for so long that depend on herding and farming for their livelihood.
Conversations with local indigenous communities, whether they're in the desert or elsewhere, was it monolithic in terms of their response to various mines being proposed, or did you find there was a diversity of opinion and people had radically different views on whether mining should be pursued nearby?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating issue. We often talk about indigenous communities or like indigenous people as though they're all one thing. And of course they're not, right? There are, thousands of different indigenous peoples all over the world, and they actually have very, very different approaches. I mean, even in the Atacama, where I went to, where I did a lot of reporting for this book, you find some folks that are absolutely dead set against all mining. They don't want to see any more lithium mining at all. Some folks, are willing to work with the mines and to accept, the mining companies in recent years have started supporting, making cash payouts to these communities, supporting development projects in there, sort of trying to share a little bit of the wealth, however belatedly. And some folks are fine with that. And for instance, where I live in Canada, I live in British Columbia in the western part of Canada, which is a big, big mining hub. There's a lot of mining that happens here. And it's the same thing. You find, some indigenous peoples are really against, mining across the board. Some don't want to see it in their own area. Some, and I think a growing number, are basically fine with it as long as it's, A, done in a reasonably environmentally responsible manner, and B, as long as they get a cut of the action, right? One thing that you're seeing a lot more of, especially here in Canada, is indigenous people who are historically, kind of the victims of mining. They tended to just get shoved aside by mining operations and then just left to deal with whatever, whatever ruined landscapes were left afterwards. Now, basically, to open a mine in Canada and lots of places, you have to have at least a certain amount of buy-in from whoever lives nearby, including indigenous communities. And so a lot of indigenous peoples here are teaming up with the mining companies and saying, fine, you can come and mine on our land, but we're going to get a cut of the profits. We expect X number of jobs. We want this kind of development. So that's a big change that's happened just in the last, couple of decades. And, is a good thing. It's a very good thing that indigenous people have gotten. They have a lot more power, a lot more legal protections, and a lot more savvy about how to in terms of how they deal with mining and other extractive industries. It's pretty amazing to see.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I mentioned this in the book. There's a big conference here in Vancouver every year that's for everybody working on major projects on indigenous in indigenous territory. So that's any kind of mining or oil and gas or infrastructure, whatever. And they all come together. It's this big conference in a very fancy hotel, and all like some of the top executives from some of the biggest world's biggest companies come up there, and major government officials come there to meet with leaders of indigenous communities here in BC. And it's only been going for a few years, but just the fact that even happens now, I just found really, it marks such a change, because I mean, indigenous people didn't even have the right to vote until 1960. So that really goes to show you how far, the playing field is still not even, but it does go to show you that it is starting to even up somewhat, which is a great thing.
What do you think accounts for that shift?
It's a number of things. It's really been happening, I think, since the 1960s. I think a lot of it, obviously a lot of it was driven by the environmental movement that really didn't exist until the late 60s, early 70s. This whole idea that corporations had any kind of responsibility to the environment. I mean, that really didn't exist, 60, 70 years ago. I mean, if you look at, the American West, which used to be probably the world's biggest mining hub 100 years ago, most of the world's copper, huge amounts of all the world's mined metals came from, Montana, Arizona, Utah, the American West. And man, those mines left us so much devastation in their wake. Metal mining is still America's biggest toxic polluter, and it's, fouled the streams and waterways, about half the streams and waterways in the West. But a lot of that was because there were literally no rules. Like, you could just come in to a place like Montana and dig an enormous, enormous copper mine, dump your tailings wherever you wanted, run your smelter, just, belch out all the smoke into the atmosphere. And there was no rules saying how much you could, limiting where and when you could dump your trash, or saying that you had to clean up after you were done. Nothing like that. So anyway, that all began to change in the 60s and 70s. And also, of course, you had, the whole movement to sort of empower marginalized communities, African Americans and Hispanics and indigenous peoples all around the world. There was a big upsurge in them, sort of claiming their rights and support for their rights. So that, I think it really dates from then, and it's kept growing since. I mean, and now it's been enshrined in international law, like the UN. There's a UN treaty called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that's, more or less binding on all member nations, that basically says you gotta take into account the needs of indigenous peoples. So it's been a long time coming, and it's been a slow build, and it's certainly not perfect, but things have definitely changed in the last few decades, and at least on that front, they've changed for the better, I would say.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
And let's talk about perhaps another prong where we're seeing a bit more pressure on mining companies coming from the consumer side. And you point out in your book that it's really the sustainability conversation and the need for traceability that has prompted consumers to make demands on mining companies. Tell us more about that train of thought.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's very, we've seen all these consumer movements for better, safer products, dolphin safe tuna and, sustainably harvested wood for paper making, et cetera, et cetera. And mining's kind of been exempted from that for a long time, basically because it doesn't, it's not a direct to consumer kind of operation, right? We're, folks like us, we consume the products that, that other companies buy from miners. But that is starting to change. I mean, I think first time I really started to notice it was the whole conversation around blood diamonds, back 10, 15 years ago, when folks started to realize, like, oh, my beautiful engagement ring might have been dug out of the ground by a enslaved child somewhere in Africa. So that got a lot of attention. And then, and it slowly spread to other metals, as we've realized that, everything's connected, and that we're not, that these products that we consume, here in the West, they come from somewhere, and they often come at great cost. So there was, I mean, back already 15, 20 years ago, you had a lot of attention around so-called conflict minerals, right, which were again being dug up in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Didn't include cobalt at the time. It was tin, tantalum, one other, I'm forgetting what, but that sort of got a lot of attention. It was the same set of issues. So I think, awareness has slowly been growing and percolating out among, from activist groups and out into the general public. There's this awareness, this growing awareness that, just like our clothes, just like our food, our digital devices. And I think that's where the awareness really comes in. It's around your cell phone, right? Now we live in an era where everybody's got a cell phone. And when you realize that, oh, my cell phone contains cobalt that might have been dug up by an 8-year-old kid in Congo, and the nickel that's also in that battery might have come from the ruins of a bulldozed Indonesian rainforest, that hits home, because that's something that we can all relate to, that's very visceral, right? My phone, we've all got our phones on us 24/7. And to hear that your phone is implicated in all these terrible things, that really hits people where they live. You know what I mean? In a way that just talking about a copper mine in some distant country does not.
Right. And you point out in your book that sort of the American approach, which is sort of not in my backyard a lot of the time for mining, because, mining hasn't been a huge domestic industry for the US, has allowed people to really sort of not think about it because it's literally happening thousands of miles away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really the history of mining in this country is really fascinating. I really didn't know anything about it before I started working on this book. But, as I said, I mean, the United States used to be a mining colossus. We still do a fair bit of mining. But really what happened is, we had this gigantic mining industry that really just created so much devastation and destruction that we're still dealing with. I mean, most of the EPA Superfund sites, some of the most polluted places in America, are still these century-old mines that are, just left these gigantic pits in the ground and these gigantic pools of toxic waste. We're still cleaning that stuff up. Anyway, what happened was, as environmental awareness really kind of got into gear in the 60s and 70s, people looked at this stuff and said, ugh, like, I don't want this in my backyard. Let's get rid of it. But of course, we still needed the metals, right? So what happened with mining was basically the same thing that's happened with so many of other American heavy industries. Is we basically said, you know what, let's just offshore it. Hey, over there in China, they're perfectly willing to run a gigantic copper smelter 24 hours a day, or we can just buy our lithium from Chile instead of digging it up in North Carolina like we used to. Like, let them do it. This is great for us. Like, let them deal with all the mess and all the chaos and destruction, and we'll just buy the stuff, and our lives will be better. And indeed, in a lot of ways it was. We've been managed to offshore most of the, a lot of the harm, a lot of the damage, and just enjoy the fruits of it, right? We get to buy our cell phones and our computers, and we're not the ones who have to deal with, having a giant lithium mine or a copper mine in our own backyard. But that is coming back to bite us in a big way, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Actually, that's a very nice segue, because you can't talk about energy without talking about geopolitics, right? And you give several examples in the book of how mining is now serving as a proxy for the dynamics between the US and China. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the thing is, while we were in the process of doing this, as we were, just offshoring all of our mining and so much of our manufacturing, it turns out that China, as with so many other industries, China was very happy to just jump in and take over. So that has created a situation where now all of the industries that are so important to this new era, to this electro-digital age, all of our, all these metals that we're talking about, lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, everything that we need to build electric cars, to build solar panels, to build wind turbines, to build all of our digital goodies, all of the supply chains for those things, to one extent or another, all run through China. So China absolutely dominates that whole arena writ large, from the mining, from the actual digging of the raw materials out of the ground, to the refining of that ore, to the processing of that stuff into the actual metals, to taking those metals and building them, turning them into the actual products, the actual solar panels, the actual wind turbines, the actual car batteries, the batteries for our digital electronics. All of that is dominated by China. So what that means is China's got an incredible amount of leverage, of geopolitical leverage, in that they can cut off the supply of those things at any time. And this is not just a hypothetical concern, it's already happened. Back in 2010, China and Japan got into a kind of diplomatic dispute. They got all mad at each other. Japan, of course, has this huge consumer electronics industry. And consumer electronics depend really heavily on a set of metals called rare earths, which we can talk more about later. But basically, this is a group of 17 like weird, obscure metals that are absolutely critical for consumer electronics and lots of other things, including electric cars. Well, China at that time controlled about 90% of the world's production of rare earths. And they said, you know what, Japan, we're going to cut off all of our rare earths to you. No more rare earths for you and your electronics industry. Well, that sent shockwaves through the entire world economy. Dozens of businesses immediately collapsed. The United States, the whole world basically freaked out. And that was kind of the moment. It's sort of the first shot, the first like warning shot in what has become this escalating struggle, this battle for control of these critical metals, as they're often called, the metals that we need for the energy transition and for our digital lives. It was that really made policymakers, corporate executives here in the US, but also all around the world, really sit up and realize, take notice and realize, like, oh my God, China is really, we are absolutely dependent on China for these raw materials and the actual products that we need for this coming new era. And that is not a good position to be in. So it's really, ever since then, that really sort of kicked off a huge amount of interest and investment in trying to find alternatives outside of China, non-China sources for all these metals. And there's been some progress on that front, but still to this day, China is overwhelmingly dominant when it comes to, as I say, the whole supply chain for all the technologies that we're going to need. And I find that very disturbing.
And it's interesting because there does seem to be a bipartisan push. We saw it under both Trump one as well as the Biden administration. We've seen this push to secure critical minerals, right? Secure minerals that are critical both for defense technologies as well as energy transition, although we'll talk later about how that latter one might be affected. And we've seen, U.S. officials fly around the world trying to get the countries and companies who are friendly to U.S. interests to buy up these mining assets. So on the one hand, it does seem like there is this renewed vigor that we hadn't seen in maybe the previous 20 years when China was busy doing this. On the other hand, at the same time, I'm sure you've had in your conversations, people point out, well, we're buying up more assets, we're buying up more mines, but how do we do it in a way that is, friendlier to the earth and less egregiously done than it was in the past? And I'm curious, as you wrote the book, how you were thinking about those, competing priorities.
Yeah, it's another like really fascinating and just, maddening contradictions, is because, we're sort of at a disadvantage here in the West, in that we we do so much more to protect the environment and to protect workers and people living nearby. So, I mean, and that's great, right? Of course, we should be, of course, we need environmental regulations. Of course, we need to, to be consulting with local communities and indigenous peoples before we open a mine in ways that they don't have to do in China or Indonesia or Myanmar, places like that. But the downside of all that is that really slows down the whole process of opening up new mines. Because in the United States, it's environmental groups have the power to file lawsuits, demand environmental impact reviews, or local folks can, file a lawsuit saying, "Oh, I don't want this mine. It might affect my groundwater, my property values, my views." That's democracy. But the problem is, it also slows down the whole process, right? It can tie up, any new mine, also any new, wind farm, any new solar project for years. So, for instance, back in the 50s, it only took about 3-4 years to open up a new copper mine. If you found a whole bunch of copper somewhere, you could start mining it in about 3-4 years. Today, it's more like 20 years. The average is well over, 10-15 years because of all the hoops that companies have to jump through. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying we should get rid of all those environmental regulations and the ability for folks to challenge mines or other new industries. I'm not, but I am saying that's another one of that. Even those things, those two come with a cost, come with a trade-off. And the trade-off is it's slowing down our transition, our ability to transition to renewable energy. And that's a real conundrum that we have yet to come to grips with. And I don't think we've got the balance right yet in this country or in Canada where I live. I really think there's a lot of, basically, anytime you try to do anything anywhere, people are going to oppose it. Somebody is going to be, there are costs, there are always costs to whatever you want to do. And we have yet to really fully accept that we need to, the biggest danger that we all face is climate change. And in order to head off climate change, we have to build more renewable energy. We have to switch over to electric cars. And that is not going to be a painless process. There are costs that are going to have to be paid. And I really don't think that message has fully sunk in here yet.
And that's one of the things I appreciated about your book was that it came from the point of view that, yes, there will be costs. We need to know what they are. We need to be cognizant of them. And maybe this isn't about absolutes anymore. Like, you can't just say no mining, right? But it's about harm reduction wherever we can. And then you have this really interesting section on recycling, reusing, and repairing, which, again, I think most people would think, oh, perfect, these are the solutions to our problems. And then you make very clear very quickly that they're not. Do you want to walk us through some of that?
Yeah, sure. So let me just say none of those things are solutions in the sense that none of them is going to save us all by itself, but they're all good things that we should be doing. They all help. But yeah, I mean, we tend to think of, recycling, especially whenever, when you talk about these issues and you say, well, okay, well, we do need renewable energy. That renewable energy requires metals. How can we get those metals without trashing the planet in the process? And our sort of instinctive response often is, oh, recycling. Recycling will help, or recycling will save us. So I want to be clear. Recycling is good. Recycling is easier on the planet than digging up fresh virgin metals. But it is not it's like everything else. It also has its own downsides, its own costs. It comes with a lot of its own trade-offs. So when we're talking about recycling metals and the things that metals are in, like our electronics, e-waste, right? If we're talking about recycling those things, it's a very different proposition from recycling, glass bottles or old paper. Metal recycling of any kind of metals requires enormous amounts of energy, which means it's got a huge carbon footprint. It's often very polluting. The process of it emits all kinds of, pollution of different kinds. And it's often done on the backs of some of the poorest people in the world. And this is something, again, that's really out of sight and therefore out of mind for most of us. But we don't realize, when you drop off your old cell phone or your old, Xbox controller, your old toaster, electric fan or whatever, if you take that to a recycling center and drop it off, that is not the end of the story. That's just the beginning of what's going to happen to that gadget. What's going to happen to it is it's going to be crushed down and processed by enormous machines. And then it's going to be almost certainly put on a container ship, a diesel burning container ship, and shipped off somewhere to some other country where it's going to be, torn apart, melted down, and until it's finally turned back into metal that can be put back into the supply chain. So all along the way, it's emitting carbon, it's burning energy, it's emitting pollution. And very often it may well wind up in a country like Nigeria, which is one of the places I went to doing reporting. I spent some time with e-waste recyclers in Lagos, Nigeria. What happens there, this is one of the places where our old electronics end up. And what happens there is there are thousands and thousands of people who are eking out a living, taking old cell phones, cracking them open with hammers and screwdrivers, pulling out what little bits of valuable metals there are inside of them, selling those little bits of metal to smelter. Well, basically what happens is they often sell them right back to the rich countries that they came from, where they can be smelted and reused again. But then the rest of the stuff, the rest of the components, the cables, the plastic, all of that stuff gets dumped or it gets burned in these huge open, it gets burned right out in the open, creating this incredibly toxic smoke that, adds to the terrible pollution in places like Lagos and is breathed in by the folks doing the burning and everybody living around them. So again, this is not to say that you shouldn't recycle your electronics. You should. Even with all of that, it's better. It's easier on the planet. It helps us. It's a net. It's not nearly as bad as just as throwing that stuff out and having to build new material out, having to build new products out of freshly dug up materials. But it also has really serious costs that we have to reckon with, and we can do it better. Right? There are definitely ways we can be making recycling cleaner and more efficient and safer for everybody. But the first step is, you got to admit that you have a problem. Recycling has a lot of problems, and we have to reckon with those.
I want to move now to some of the policy prescriptions that you give in the book for governments, for companies, for individuals. And you also go through some examples of cities or companies who are doing it right. And that's a very broad statement, so I'll let you interpret this as broadly as you wish. But tell me about what needs to happen in any of the spheres that we've talked about, or any that we haven't, that you think would set humanity on I guess a better path.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the basic guidance is something we've known for a long time. It's that old slogan that's been around since the 70s of reduce, reuse, recycle. That's sort of the big prescription of what we should be doing. The problem is, the one that gets the most attention is recycle. Everybody's familiar with recycling, right? And we already talked about that. So listen, again, on balance, recycling is a good thing. We could be doing more of it. We should be doing more of it. Let's have more recycling. But it's certainly not going to get us. It's certainly not a solution all on its own. Also because it's just inadequate. There's no way we can recycle all of the metals that we use. And in any case, we're going to need lots more metals. We need more metals than are already in circulation. We're going to have to dig up more of them. So what else can we do? Well, there's the reuse part of the equation. And this is something that we should be, this is like reusing a product is a much more efficient way to get more use out of it than recycling, right? Recycling, like I said, It's very energy intensive. It's really difficult to do. It takes a lot of energy. It's expensive. Well, rather than, recycling your old iPhone, much better if you can just keep on using that iPhone or repair it. If it breaks down, get it fixed. And this is something that's really, that used to be much more common in the US and elsewhere. We used to have a much bigger repair industry. But nowadays, of course, it's much more common to just, your thing breaks, your dustbuster breaks, your cordless drill breaks down. Really, the default is, we'll just throw it out and get a new one. That's bad, right? That's just tremendously wasteful. It's tremendously inefficient. But it's also part of the reason that we don't repair things is because of deliberate corporate strategy. It is not, a lot of our modern gadgets are very difficult to repair, and that's by design. A lot of the electronics makers have really very deliberately and consciously made it difficult to get spare parts to repair things, made it difficult to get the information that you need, repair manuals that you need to be able to fix a thing, and sometimes even the tools that you need. I mean, I'm talking to you on a MacBook. This MacBook cannot be opened with regular screwdrivers. You need a special Apple-specific screwdriver just to open the thing up. So the good news is on that front, though, that too is starting to change. There's something called the right to repair movement that's actually gaining a lot of traction in the US and really around the world. And that's been being driven by activists who are trying to force companies to make their products easier to repair. And they've actually had, just in the last year or two, they've had some real successes. There's several states, Massachusetts, California, a couple of other places, have passed laws that force manufacturers to make their products easier to repair, to make them more accessible, to make spare parts more accessible, and to design them in such a way that, for instance, you can take out if the battery starts to fail in your laptop, they're making it easier to take that battery out and just swap in a new one. So reusing stuff, it's a much more efficient way to use the metals that we've already harvested. And therefore, the longer that you can keep a product in use, the less demand there is for fresh, virgin mined materials. There's also another way that we're reusing things, which is just to literally put them in, use them for another purpose. So electric car batteries, we're going to have millions and millions of electric car batteries that have reached the end of their lives as electric car for electric cars. They don't have the performance after a few years that you need to use them in cars, but they can still hold a pretty decent charge. So I went and talked to this company in California that's one of several that's had the idea of okay, we'll take these batteries that have been in use, that have been in a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla or whatever for 5 years, and they're starting to run down. They don't hold as much of a charge. But if we take 100 of those batteries and pack them together in a container, that's a pretty good storage battery that we can use to gather electricity and then use that electricity to run stuff at night, for off-grid power use, for a backup generator in your house, whatever. That's a really good way to reuse those batteries. So all those are good things. But for my money, the best way that we as individuals, that we as consumers can help with all these problems that I'm talking about, the best way that we can reduce the need for new metals and also for energy in general is to not own cars. And I'm not saying that nobody should own a car. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you own a car. I own a car. Obviously, in the US and elsewhere, lots of people need cars. That's fine. But the thing is, we don't need nearly as many cars as we've currently got on the roads certainly in the United States and in Canada where I live. Most of us live in cities. Most Americans, most people worldwide live in cities. And we can design our cities in ways in much more efficient, more effective ways to where we don't all need cars to get around. If we have more public transit, and if we can make our cities safer and easier to get around on by bicycle and by foot, then we really take away a lot of the need to own a car. And I can tell you from personal experience, this is really doable. So I used to live in Los Angeles with my wife and our 2 kids and our dog and our cat. And of course, Los Angeles, we needed 2 cars to get, to and from work, to get the kids to school, to, go grocery shopping, all the rest of it. Fine, we had 2 cars. We moved a few years ago back to my hometown, Vancouver, Canada. And in Vancouver, they've really done a lot to basically to make it easier to live life without a car. So there's a whole network of bicycle paths that basically enable you to get all over the city safely, that are physically separated from cars, so that you can ride your bike really safely and easily, get here, get there. They've got a pretty decent public transit system. And the net result is we've only got 1 car now. We're able to live our lives and get everywhere we need to using only 1 car. So that's what I mean. I'm not saying it's terrible to own a car, but I am saying if we can live our lives and design our cities in ways where we don't need so many cars, that will do more than anything else to reduce the demand, the need for all these metals that we're talking about. And
you end up short-circuiting the system a bit. In just our last few minutes left, I wanted to be sure to ask you about the election, because your book comes out in the wake of the U.S. election, of course. And I'm curious how you think the results will impact the future or some of these policy ideas that you've given rise to in the final chapters of your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be bad, essentially. I think Donald Trump has made no secret of the fact that he's, he loves fossil fuels. He's all about drill, baby, drill. And that's, it's going to slow down the energy transition. I don't think there's any doubt about it. One of the best things for my money that the Biden administration did was put in place the Inflation Reduction Act, which poured billions and billions of dollars into supporting renewable energy and also critical metals, and also, trying to really build up the critical metal supply chain here in the US. I think a lot of that is sort of might be on the chopping block under a Trump administration. I think it's going to slow things down, but I don't think it's going to stop it. One reason being that a lot of those billions of dollars are flowing into red states, places like Texas, that are already, there's so much in the pipeline already to build out solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, all the rest of it. I think, there's too much already in progress to stop. But I do think it's going to slow it down. I think worldwide, there's too much momentum for any one country to stop. There's so much momentum already towards renewables and towards electric cars, especially, that I don't want to say it doesn't matter what we do in the US, but really we're actually a relatively small player in this space. It's China where, that's really driving production of solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars. They produce much more of that stuff than we do in the US. So I think, bottom line, a Trump administration is probably going to slow the energy transition, which is a bad thing, but it's by no means going to stop it.
Great. Well, Vince, thanks so much for taking the time to chat here today. Really enjoyed your book and the conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And if I can just be forgiven one quick plug, besides the book, I also have a newsletter also called Power Metal, where I try to, keep folks up to date on sort of the latest developments of all these issues that we've just been talking about. So
great.
That's my little bit of self-promotion on this.
You have to. You're an author. You have to.
Exactly. Thank you. Thanks for knowing that.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and follow us on X at C-SPAN Radio. If you like podcasts that highlight discussions with authors of nonfiction books, check out the Q&A podcast.